Progress.
Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha of Ekev, the Torah describes for us Eretz Yisrael, the beauty and natural abundance of the country. Ki Hashem Elokecha meviacha al Eretz Tova. The Baruch Shalom brings us to a good place. Eretz Yisrael, Chazal say, Yifei Nof Mesos Kol Haaretz. It has beauty in it. There's every climate imaginable in a small area. Mayanos Tahomos, Yotzim Min Abika Min Ahor. There's fresh water. There's three main rivers in the north that feed the Jordan, that in turn feeds the Yam Kinneret. It's a wondrous place. The Rabbi Shalom, especially in Moshe here in the Parsha, casts it in physical terms. He doesn't say Eretz, that later on he'll say that there's always spirituality there, there's the Mincha Maariv, everything. But this week's Parsha doesn't say that. This week's Parsha, he describes it as a tourist guide. And he describes the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. Chita, Sorah, all of the fruits that exist. Chazal mentioned that everything that is mentioned in the Parsha has a relationship to the halacha of brachas that we have, and to the order of the brachas. So chita, sorah, which is mezonos, grain, precedes eitz and adoma. There's a famous, it's true, I've heard it from many great people. In Europe, many times when they wanted to try out a young yeshiva student, whether he would be worthy of being the Rav in the community or not, they made like a smorgasbord for him. So there was, this died, I think. Didn't like it.
That's fine.
Gotta finish the story there. Yeah, smorgasbord. So they would serve all sorts of fruits and vegetables and cookies and cake, and see if the Rav knew how to make the order of the brachas in the proper manner. So the story is told, the legend is told, about one of the great Rabbonim in Europe, Rabbi Landau, the notable Yehuda. So he became the Rav in Prague when he was only 27 years old. So he was very young. And he was coming after Rabbi Innocent Prager. And the story was that they set this table before him, and he was nervous, and he absent-mindedly took a grape, and he made a boy plates on it. So the Balabatim said to him, Rebbe, Mizanos, there's Mizonos on the table. Mizonos is precedence, you're supposed to eat that first. So he said, I don't eat mizonos. And for the rest of his life, he never ate mizonos because he didn't want to be proven to be the teller of a falsehood. So he said he never eats mizonos. I heard that story from Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky told me that the first year that he was married, so they were at his wife's parents' home for the Seder, for Pesach. And he said his wife, his mother-in-law, who was a great tzaddikus and a very fine woman, was a terrible cook. It was just like eating straw. So she served knedlach. And the knedlach, he said, were like cannonballs. I mean, you couldn't eat it. So he didn't eat it. So she said to him, Yaakov, how come you're not eating the knedlach? So he said, I don't eat gebrokts. And for the rest of his life, he never ate gebrokts, even though there was a pure litvake, and the whole family eats gebrokts. But he never ate gebrokts again, because he had told his mother-in-law that he doesn't eat gebrokts to avoid eating.
What's a gebrokts, Rabbi? It's
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize we had a true Jew here. Gebrokts is matzah meal mixed in water. Anything that's made from matzah meal, shruya, matzah shruya. So this was a common thing in Europe to see if you knew the order of the brachot. And the order of the brachot are dependent on the psukim in this week's parsha, which came first, so to speak, which is more important as a food for sustenance of life. And the end it says, Zeis shemen udvash. So Zeis is olives. Shemen is olive oil. And when the Gemara talks about shemen, they're not talking about vegetable oil. And for many, many centuries, the only kosher oil, so to speak, was olive oil. It was used, and in Europe it was very hard to get. Vegetable oil, which is really made from soybeans, did not become available till the late 1890s. There's a big tshuva in the Marsham, who was one of the great poskim in Poland at the end of the 19th century, as to whether or not vegetable oil was kosher, because they were afraid that they would mix it with animal substance as well. And that was always a problem. It was a problem in the United States until the 1930s, when Crisco came into Procter & Gamble, made Crisco as a kosher shortening. I remember in my mother's house, the shortening that we used was chicken fat, which was cholesterol heaven, but it was, but that's what it was. And on Pesach, you would smear it on the matzah, and that was it. And there was none of what is available today and what we take for granted. So that's shemen. And dvash, so dvash is honey. So when we say honey, we immediately think of dvash dvorim, bee honey. But that's not the dvash that the Torah is speaking about, nor the dvash that Chazal spoke about. Their dvash was dvash tmarim. And they made it from dates and from other sweet fruit. And they let it sit until like the fruit exploded, the juice that came out of it was very sweet. In fact, was oversweet. And that was the dvash that was used. And so when they speak about dvash, they're speaking about dvash from fruit. They're not speaking about dvash from dvorim, from bees. The rishayla that arose in halacha, how are you allowed to eat honey from bees? The bee itself is tome. Kol hayotze min hatome tome. Anything that comes from an animal that is not kosher, not clean, so then naturally the product that comes from it is tainted with the same product, with the same problem. So how do we eat honey? So the Gemara says there were students of, they knew animals and insects and birds, and they knew it. So there's a sac, a little sac in the bee where the honey is stored. And that is not connected, so to speak, to the circulatory system of the insect itself. And when they come back to the hive, they discharge that for the queen bee, etc., the whole miraculous process of bees. And therefore they said it's not kol hadovra yotze min hatome, because it's not yotze min hatome, it's not part of the tome. The tome only carries it along, but it's not part of it. So we had this shayla, also an interesting point. I remember when I was in the OU. So there are candies, sweets that are coated with a very shiny substance, like M&Ms and other mints, and that is made from something called shellac. Now, shellac also makes a type of paint protector. Where does shellac come from? In the stand for longer periods of time, and it becomes the lac, what to do with this shiny substance. So I remember I had a conversation with Rabbi Feinstein about it, and he said it's the same thing like honey. And I was amazed that he knew that, because he didn't have a university degree in insects. But then we went to people who did, and we examined the lac, and it's true, it has a completely separate little compartment in which this liquid is gathered, and then you can extract the liquid from this separate compartment without affecting the insect. So it's just like dvash dvorim. It has the same halacha. And therefore, just like dvash dvorim is mutter, so the lac was mutter. Now, it's interesting that in halacha, we find many tshuvas regarding dvash. But it's regarding the fact that when they collect the honey, sometimes they get parts of the bees in it too. So the question is, does that become bottle? If you got a whole bee, it never becomes bottle, burial or betela. But if you got parts, you got wings or legs or antenna. I don't mean to discourage you from using honey, but you should know with his only treffen v'his treft, right? That in the process, it's almost unavoidable that you shouldn't have some appendage of the bee that got into the honey. So then the whole shaila occurs, boil it, etc. But it's the poskim have long held that raw honey is permissible, and that processed honey is also permissible. So when we think of dvash, we are thinking of this processed honey that comes in a bottle, that comes from bees. But the Torah, when it speaks about zeis shemen udvash, the Torah is talking about a dvash that comes from fruit, that becomes overripe, and that out of that there secretes fluid that can be processed and turned into a sweetener. So the Torah describes you're going to have all of this. You're going to have chita, sorah, geffen, everything you're going to have. Wondrous land. And that is so that the Jewish people would appreciate Eretz Yisrael. And all the Meforshim have said throughout the ages that Eretz Yisrael produces only when the Jewish people are there, produces for the Jewish people. 100 years ago, the agriculture here was zero. My father was here in 1925. He said there was not a tomato in the country. And today, cold too, shefa. So that's something that we should appreciate. When you go to Machne Yehuda, to the Shuk, just stand and look. You're seeing a miracle that came true. And that's the bracha that we see in this week's Parsha, that the Rebbeinu Shalom promised us that that's how Eretz Yisrael would look. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashi, Omer Ratzak HaKadosh was Akash, as Yisrael, if Chibur Lahem Torah, Mitzvot, Shenemra, Ananor Chafetz Man Tzidko, Yagdil Torah V'Yadil.